Because of Dr. Mudd's heroics during the yellow fever epidemic, the restrictions that conspirators were living under was eased somewhat. Dr. Mudd's mail was no longer subject to an inspector or a censor. The mail the conspirators received now was pretty much never opened, and they could receive any care package they wanted to. Essentially, for the rest of 1867 into 1868, conditions on the fort for the conspirators was really the best it could be. Then, in March of 1868, the fort got a new commander, Major McConnell. Now, McConnell had actually been stationed at Fort Jefferson earlier during the conspirators' sentence as a supporting officer, and he was known then for his acts of cruelty upon the troops. Both Samuel Arnold and Colonel Grenfell, their friend, noted the many times in which he forced soldiers to be strung up by their thumbs or have to carry a heavy cannonball all around the fort in the hot, hot sun until they collapsed. One of Colonel Grenfell's letters about these acts of cruelty that he sent home to a friend was published in a newspaper. This caused an investigation of McConnell by the War Department, and he was censored by courts-martial.
But 2 years later, McConnell had been reinstated and was now the commander of the garrison he used to torment. McConnell held a grudge against the state prisoners, and Colonel Grenfell in particular for having ratted on him in 1866. Soon, Major McConnell assigned Grenfell the most labor-intensive duties on the fort, wearing down the older prisoner. One day, completely overwhelmed by exhaustion, Colonel Grenfell stated he could not perform his duties. As a result, Major McConnell had him loaded down with rocks and dunked repeatedly into the moat. The conspirators watched the torture of their friend from their casemate cell. They were convinced the major was going to drown Grenfell, and he certainly would have had not a party of ladies arrived at the fort at that moment and observed the proceedings. Colonel Grenfell was removed from the moat and locked in the dungeon cell he had occupied 2 years before. Grenfell knew that to stay at the fort any longer would mean his certain death. On the night of March 6, 1868, Colonel Grenfell, 3 other prisoners, and a disgruntled soldier stationed at the fort stole a boat under the cover of darkness. The next morning, when the men and the boat were discovered missing, a steamer was sent to chase after them. But stormy seas caused the steamer to return. Colonel Grenfell and his associates were never heard from again, and they likely perished in the storm. Still, rumors persisted that Grenfell had made it to Cuba and lived in hiding there.
3 of the 4 conspirators sentenced to Fort Jefferson received life sentences. Michael O'Laughlin completed his life sentence when he died of yellow fever in 1867. How to get off of Fort Jefferson with their lives was a continual conundrum to the other 2 lifers, Mudd and Arnold. Edmund Spangler also hoped to leave, but his 6-year sentence was something he took in stride. As we've seen from early on, Dr. Mudd tried his hand at escaping, but the punishment he received prevented him from doing so again. And so both he and Arnold and Edmund Spangler started to think of legal ways they could escape from this island.
From the beginning of his imprisonment, Dr. Mudd had tried to get the lawyers from his trial to work on an appeal of some sort. Unfortunately, both Thomas Ewing and Frederick Stone were not particularly interested and felt that it was too soon after the trial to attempt any appeal. Dr. Mudd angrily followed the news surrounding the release of Confederate President Jefferson Davis and the civil trial of escaped conspirator John Surratt in 1867 that ended in a hung jury. From Dr. Mudd's perspective, the petition from the soldiers regarding his valor during the yellow fever outbreak had gone nowhere.
By August of 1868, another change of commanders had loosened the restrictions on the conspirators. This allowed Dr. Mudd to write to a lawyer in Key West that he had heard about. This lawyer offered to take up the case of any prisoner at Fort Jefferson for only $100 down and $100 paid upon release. The conspirators wrote to him, and a few weeks later, he arrived at the fort to meet with them in person. Now, his name was Walter Maloney, Jr., and this is his gravestone here in Key West Cemetery. Maloney was hired by the men to take up their appeal. Recent court cases in front of the Supreme Court had held that military trials of civilians were unconstitutional, and thus Maloney decided he would try to make an appeal on behalf of the conspirators. There were also a number of amnesty proclamations directed towards former Confederates that Maloney hoped would help in this appeal. But unfortunately for the men, District Judge Thomas Boynton declined to act on the appeal, reaffirming the military's original belief in 1865 that the conspirators were essentially enemy combatants and thus a military trial was appropriate. Maloney offered to appeal to the Supreme Court and was in the process of doing so. However, it was very slow going, and the conspirators would have to wait.
The quickest route for clemency in the case of the conspirators was through a presidential pardon. Even if Johnson had personally favored clemency for the imprisoned conspirators, the wrath of the nation in 1865 precluded him from doing much in their favor. As the years passed, the quest for revenge had passed, but it would still have been political suicide for Johnson to have pardoned them. The radical Republicans, with whom Johnson was in a bitter war with, would have weaponized any sympathy Johnson might have shown to the men at Fort Jefferson. They had already tried to find a way to involve him in his predecessor's death, making clemency for the conspirators a non-starter for most of their imprisonment. But after word of Dr. Mudd's actions at the fort spread, public sentiment started to change regarding the conspirators. Relatives of the men championed their cause of freedom to high-profile individuals in Maryland. The Hartford County Medical Association wrote a petition on behalf of Dr. Mudd, and seemed to be the originator of the idea that Dr. Mudd was merely following his Hippocratic oath when he treated the wounded John Wilkes Booth. The mayor of Baltimore wrote on behalf of Arnold and Spangler's release, both men having been residents of the city. A delegation of Maryland congressmen met with President Johnson in January of 1869 to petition for Dr. Mudd's release. The president replied to their meeting by saying, "It is only a question of time."
President Andrew Johnson survived being removed from office by impeachment in March of 1868, but he failed to, of course, be renominated by his party for the presidency in July. On November 3rd, 1868, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president, but his term of service would not start until March 4th, as was tradition. This left a very long period of time for Andrew Johnson to consider his final presidential acts. And of course, like most presidents even today, he started thinking about presidential pardons. There was no more damage that could be done politically to Johnson that he hadn't already endured, and so pardoning the conspirators was now something he was willing to consider. On February 8, 1869, President Andrew Johnson pardoned Dr. Samuel Mudd. A few days later, Mrs. Mudd arrived at the White House to receive the release papers in person. President Johnson apologized to Mrs. Mudd for not releasing her husband earlier than this, but he explained that he just could not do so until now. She thanked him and then made her way to the port of Baltimore, where she had hoped to hop on a ship in order to deliver his release papers in person at the Dry Tortugas. However, she missed the steamer by a matter of hours, and the next one was not scheduled to depart for 2 to 3 weeks.
Mrs. Mudd sent the pardon papers by express to her brother in New Orleans. Upon receipt of them, her brother paid a man $300 to personally deliver them to Dr. Mudd at the Dry Tortugas. The pardon was received at Fort Jefferson on March 8th.
Dr. Mudd was immediately released. After almost 4 years in imprisonment, Dr. Samuel A. Mudd was finally a free man. But he couldn't leave the island right away. He had to wait 3 days for a ship to come here to take him to Key West. Finally, on March 11th, he boarded the USS Matchless and departed the Dry Tortugas forever. On March 1st, 3 days before the end of his term of office, Andrew Johnson pardoned the 2 remaining Lincoln conspirators here at Fort Jefferson, Samuel Arnold and Edmund Spangler. The men learned of their impending release via telegram. According to Arnold, when news spread that they were going to be released, they were heartily congratulated by every officer here at the fort.
Samuel Arnold's father traveled down to the Dry Tortugas to present the pardons in person. On March 29, 1869, Arnold and Spangler departed Fort Jefferson and made their way home. After nearly 4 years of imprisonment, the Lincoln conspirators' time at the Dry Tortugas had finally come to an end. Despite ongoing construction for over 30 years, Fort Jefferson was never fully completed. Advances in weaponry made the masonry fort obsolete by the late 1860s. After repeated hurricanes and another outbreak of yellow fever in 1873, the post was disbanded, with only a small caretaking crew assigned to it. Fort Jefferson saw a partial resurrection during the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the site was once again manned and used as a coaling station for the nation's fleet. At the end of the conflict, the giant fortress on the Gulf was left to sleep once more. In 1935, President Roosevelt declared Fort Jefferson to be a national monument, and work was done by the WPA to help fix up the crumbling structure. Over time, most of the interior buildings were demolished or destroyed through acts of nature. In 1992, the entire Dry Tortugas, including Fort Jefferson, became a national park. The three conspirators who survived their imprisonment at Fort Jefferson did their best to return to their previous lives. Edmund Spangler went back to work for theater owner John T. Ford, who had always advocated for the innocence of his stagehand. A fire burned down the Holiday Street Theater in Baltimore in 1873, putting Spangler out of a job. So he made his way to Charles County, Maryland, and the farm of his former cellmate turned friend, Dr. Mudd. The doctor took Spangler in, and the carpenter lived on the Mudd farm until his death in 1875 at the age of 49. Dr. Mudd had been greatly missed by his wife and their 4 children. After his return, 5 more children were born as the doctor returned to his life of farming and the occasional medical call. In 1877, Mudd campaigned to be elected to the Maryland State Legislature, but he was defeated. Dr. Mudd died in 1883 at the age of 49. For many years, some descendants of Dr. Mudd have attempted to have his conviction overturned. Dr. Richard Mudd, a grandson of Samuel Mudd, lived to be 101 years old, and spent the majority of that time advocating on behalf of his grandfather's alleged innocence. In 1933, he unsuccessfully petitioned Congress to rename Fort Jefferson to Fort Samuel A. Mudd. He wrote to multiple presidents asking for executive action to exonerate the doctor, but all replied that this was beyond their power, as Dr. Mudd had accepted guilt when he took Andrew Johnson's pardon in 1869. While an official exoneration was always out of reach, Richard Mudd did find great success in the field of public opinion. To this day, many people erroneously believe that Dr. Samuel Mudd was unjustly punished for merely fulfilling his Hippocratic oath when he set John Wilkes Booth's broken leg after the assassination. In reality, Dr. Mudd knew Booth before the assassination, and there is strong evidence proving that he knew about and was actively helping Booth with his initial plot to abduct President Lincoln. The innocent country doctor theme, present in films like The Prisoner of Shark Island and The Ordeal of Dr. Mudd, may have made Dr. Mudd into a folk hero to some, but these portrayals are in no way supported by the historical evidence. In short, the doctor's name is still Mudd. Samuel Arnold did his best to return to a life of obscurity after returning home to Baltimore. He worked for his father, who was a baker, for many years before becoming a butcher. Arnold never married and became a bit of a hermit in his later years. When a different Samuel Arnold died in 1902 and the newspapers ran obituaries for the Lincoln assassination conspirator, the very much alive Arnold became upset at how he was portrayed. This motivated him to write his memoirs, which were published in a serialized form in the Baltimore American newspaper. Arnold died in 1906 at the age of 72. Samuel Arnold was buried in Greenmount Cemetery in Baltimore, the same cemetery where his former cellmate, Michael O'Laughlin, had been interred in 1870. Greenmount is also the final resting place of the man chiefly responsible for the conspirators and the entire nation's suffering.
For so many who lived at Fort Jefferson, this was a land of hardship, illness, and death. But it is also a land of beauty and biological diversity. I hope that these videos have helped give you a sense of what life was like for the 4 Lincoln assassination conspirators who lived here for 3.5 years. I'd like to thank you all for coming on this journey through history with me. But now, if you'll allow me, I think it's time I take off this microphone and enjoy the beauty of Dry Tortugas National Park in person. Until next time, I'm Dave Taylor from LincolnConspirators.com, signing off.